Hey,
Welcome,
thank you very
everyone.
much.
This is Mark Lair, and we're previewing again. This is our series for the infrastructure conference that Norm Anderson is running, the CGLA conference that'll be in Washington, D.C. And we're fortunate enough to have Dr. Sunita Satyapal from the Department of Energy to talk about hydrogen. And the framework here, and Norm's going to set the stage, is really getting people interested in this conference and thinking about the key themes. So when they come to the conference, either physically or virtually, that they're all aware about what's at stake in the coming weeks and months. Norm, over to you.
Well, thanks so much, Mark. And it's a pleasure to see you, Sunita. Thank you so much. And, thanks for all your work in hydrogen. I think you've been at DOE for 18 years and you're the director of the hydrogen program. We really appreciate you taking the time. This is really exciting, a super exciting moment for the country. And I know it's really great for you, all the hard work you've done. Let me ask you a question really quickly, because you guys recently launched your Earthshot program. What is it and how does it work? How do you think about it? How should we think about it?
Great. Well, thank you, Norm. And first of all, thanks for the invitation and to both of you and for all your leadership in terms of pushing clean energy. And it's a pleasure to be here. And so as a reminder, in April, during the climate summit, President Biden asked the Secretary of Energy, what more can we do to really accelerate progress and address some of the critical challenges to help, tackle the climate crisis? And so that was the beginning of the Energy Earthshots initiative. So in June, Secretary Granholm announced the first in a series of Energy Earthshots, and that's Hydrogen Shot. And these are really bold, ambitious targets. They're meant to be an all hands on deck call for innovation, collaboration, really acceleration of our clean energy technologies, and look at some of those critical technologies that can enable an impact. So we're using the Sunshot model that was launched over a decade ago, and that helped to lower the cost of solar, of PV. And so with Hydrogen Shot, the goal is, again, an easily articulated, bold, ambitious target of $1 for 1 kilogram of clean hydrogen in 1 decade. And so that is the initiative. And today, hydrogen from natural gas is already $1.50 or even less. And so again, the goal, we have various numbers, but in terms of a baseline or 2020 baseline for hydrogen from electrolysis, is around $5, again, at low volume. And so that's an 80% reduction. So again, the Energy Earthshots will be these large, concerted, coordinated efforts to galvanize the entire community and focus on these really challenging areas, because there's a lot of potential for hydrogen, but we still need to reduce cost. There's infrastructure challenges and so forth. So we're not overhyping hydrogen. There's again a lot of potential, but we need to focus and address some of the challenges.
That's great. And before Mark jumps in, I just wanted to highlight that running around the country, you see an enormous amount of private sector interest in hydrogen, and especially investor interest in hydrogen. It's extraordinary. Over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Norman. Sunita, we're really trying to create awareness, almost a breakthrough mindset for people that are attending physically or virtually for this. And you've seen incredible growth in the interest in hydrogen and advances. And we're trying to come up with language, Norman and I, that really captivate the people that are not as exposed to it up till now as we go through this infrastructure. And we're wondering, could we call it a breakthrough fuel? The other idea that I have is, with solar and wind, we see those up in our yards and things like that. Is this the invisible alternative? Help us come up with language that could captivate people as we walk into this conference.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mark. And I think it is true that hydrogen's just not as well known or understood compared to other examples like solar, wind, batteries. And I think that's partly because in many ways it's an enabler, it's an enabling technology. So people talk about how hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe, which is true. It's 3/4 of hydrogen, but you still have to produce it. It's not for the most part free hydrogen on Earth. But I think the one word that a lot of people have used is versatility and sort of the Swiss Army knife approach. because you can produce it from diverse domestic feedstocks, obviously renewables, fossil with CCS, nuclear, really all the opportunities. But then you can also use it for many different applications and end uses. And so that's where, and across sectors. So I think that's why there's a little bit of complexity, because it's already a feedstock. We produce over 10 million metric tons of hydrogen in the US. That's almost a seventh of the world supply. So it's used for petroleum refining, for fertilizer production. But I think where there's a lot of interest is, for instance, using intermittent renewables, producing hydrogen with electrolysis, storing that hydrogen, so enabling long duration storage. Once you store it, it can be more dispatchable. So it's not just about electrons or electricity. It can be used as a fuel, for instance, to decarbonize heavy duty transport for industrial applications. Steel manufacturing alone, for instance, is almost 8% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Obviously, refining, ammonia, industrial applications will need clean sources. So where there's no alternative or it's hard to electrify, that's where hydrogen can come in, again, as a feedstock or as a fuel. You can blend it into the natural gas pipeline. It helps you decarbonize, multiple sectors. And then, of course, in fuel cells, it offers resiliency, stationary power, zero pollutants as well, or low pollutants. It's not just carbon emissions. So again, there's so many different opportunities, and that's partly why there's a little bit of complexity. We use the term H2 at scale. Other countries use the term sector coupling sometimes, but I think, again, that versatility aspect and the ability to be dispatchable, to cover multiple applications, multiple sectors, that sort of Swiss Army knife approach is maybe one way that might help to think about it.
That's really great.
All-around athlete that plays three sports. If I'm trying to, you can see where I'm going with this, Sunita. We're trying to get the mainstream to really grab onto this and support you. Norm?
No, I think that's really great, Sunita. One of the things that as I run around the country, I run into all sorts of Sunita acolytes, right? People who think you are the person who knows what they're doing. And we have coming to the event is our friend from UT Austin. And he's the first person who really made it clear to me that we're ready to go live almost on hydrogen. I think that was really interesting. So I guess my last question to you is, you're funding a lot of really interesting research around the country. Where do you see, for lack of a better term, a breakthrough coming? Is it going to be in production? Is it going to be in transportation? This idea that we produce all the wind power in the middle of the country, and it would be great if we could move the molecules to the coast where it's useful. Or is it going to be in vehicle technology innovation? One of the things that I'm most excited about as an infrastructure person is addressing the GHG issues. This other issue, which is really interesting, is that you can see, in your mind's eye, for lack of a better term, an enormous amount of industrial innovation about to happen all across the value chain. So just to get a sense of where you see breakthroughs eventually happening.
Yeah, no, thanks again, Norm, and also for all your work in terms of infrastructure over the years. And this is definitely a team effort, multiple players. We have hundreds of projects, as you mentioned, at DOE, also coordinate internationally. So I think really the key is maybe I'll mention that two-pronged approach. So we have just launched. We still need to focus on cost reduction to enable really a sustainable and competitive market. We know subsidies and policy will help, but really to have impact and get to scale, we still need to reduce cost. So we've launched some really landmark consortia. One is the Million Mile Fuel Cell Truck Consortium, and that brings in our national labs, industry, academia, really experts to focus on how do we reduce cost for the heavy duty truck or medium duty truck application. And so both cost, durability, and so we have concrete targets. The other one I'll mention on the R&D side is a new consortium. So both these we're looking at at least 100 million and that's called H2New, and that's for next generation of electrolysis of water. So these two are, really concerted, cohesive, all hands on deck consortia, bringing in private sector, public partnerships, and again, looking at how do we get those costs down. But then in addition, I'll mention how many of our projects are de-risking or demonstrating first of a kind prototypes in the field. So not just focusing on laboratory work. So we have, the first passenger ferry project where we'll be refueling on a floating barge, setting up the infrastructure there, the fueling protocols. We have the first data center project. In fact, Microsoft is involved there. We have 4 nuclear to hydrogen projects also that we're co-funding. Obviously, renewables, really integrating and looking at the entire ecosystem for these, roughly megawatt scale. So then we'd be able to scale to gigawatts. And so I think really the key as we think about this and clusters developing is how do we have large scale production, but then also multiple off-takers? It's not necessarily just one application. So we have interest, for instance, with fleets of trucks or buses, and then obviously the industrial end use. So the large fertilizer or steel plants. We have 2 steel projects, high steel, again, the R&D to enable an effective deployment strategy. And so I think basically looking at those, coupling of production with demand and off-takers, so we could create, in some cases, co-locate. So we would reduce the burden in terms of infrastructure cost and ensure that we don't just focus on the production and the supply, but have that, optimization in terms of demand and off-takers. So I think those are some of the exciting areas. And maybe one last one I'll give just as a very concrete example that might help is we funded under the Recovery Act, if you remember, over a decade ago, we were sort of in a similar phase, and we funded some early demonstrations of backup power for cell phone towers and then also forklifts. And this was, very early. And now we have over 45,000 hydrogen fuel cell forklifts, over 100 stations, a growing ecosystem infrastructure, major companies, Amazon, Walmart, others, and in their warehouses, completely zero emissions. In fact, every few seconds, some customers refueling with hydrogen for their hydrogen fuel cell forklift. So that's an example I think most people are not aware of, but it's how some of this funding can help to catalyze niche market that can enable some of these technologies to get traction.
That's fantastic, Sunita. Mark, you and I should be the marketing arm for the federal government for communicating some of these success stories that nobody knows about. I had no idea about the 45,000 forklifts until I ran into the Caterpillar people in Austin, Texas, and they described how much hydrogen they use and how enthusiastic they were about hydrogen. So this is really fantastic. I'm going to leave the last thank you for Mark, but I want to thank you, Sunita. It's really great to see you. Thanks for all the great work you're doing. We really appreciate it. And it's fantastic to be able to benefit the whole country from all that you're doing.
Thank you.
Well, the infrastructure story is coming together. Hydrogen is the first day. It's the Wednesday, the 27th. Sunita will be the keynote speaker at 2:15. Physically at the Marriott Marquis in Washington and virtually on openexchange.tv. I've got that circled. The other one I have circled that pulls this versatility together, Sunita, is I think it's at 4:00. We've got the mayor of Lancaster, California, is going to talk about Hydrogen City. And I think that'll be another format to pull all these different things that you're working on together. We appreciate your time today for a preview to get people warmed up to see you in person and virtually in a couple of weeks' time. Thank you. Thanks, everybody, for joining.
Thank you so much for all of your efforts and leadership.
Thank you, Sunita.
Thanks.